You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. With me today, your host, Naseem Ahmed. A major organization, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, the world's leading source of data on internal displacement, will be releasing its annual report on internal displacement from 2023. Israel's war in Gaza and Sudan accounts for a large number of displacement, taking the total to 76 million for last year. And in today's conversation, I want to speak with one of the senior authors of that report, researcher, Ivana Hajzmanova. And I'm really thrilled to have Ivana join MEMO to go through this report in detail. Ivana, welcome to the show.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, so Ivana is the Global Monitoring Manager. She has been coordinating the production of internal displacement estimates since 2016, I believe. And she's an expert on the MENA region, sub-Saharan Africa, and she's been in that team since 2020. And you can get the full profile and the bio Ivana from our website. But let's begin, Ivana, if we may, with you just telling us about the center itself, Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, and why it's important to document trends in internal displacement and how long that trend has been monitored by your organization.
Thank you. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre was established back in the late 1990s to respond to the increasing number of people who were displaced within the border of their countries, and their needs and the scale of the crises remained largely invisible for the international community. So to respond to that, IDMC was established back in 1998 to mostly monitor internal displacement linked with conflict and violence. But then 10 years later, we also added the monitoring of disaster displacement. And as of today, IDMC is considered to be the authoritative voice when it comes to data and analysis on internal displacement worldwide. And why is it important to monitor internal displacement and all the trends? Well, first of all, it's really about keeping the issue of internal displacement high on the international agenda, and make sure that IDPs and their plight is visible. Second, it's also to, of course, understand the scale and the severity of the displacement crises across the world, and to be able to measure progress towards solutions and seeing how the displacement crises can be resolved. Last, our data is also used to guide policy making and decision making when it comes, when to invest, when it comes to long-term investments to support IDPs and help them end their situation.
So give us a global picture of the main hotspots in terms of internal displacement that's taking place around the world. What are the major hotspots at the moment in 2023, last year?
I think it's really important to remember that internal displacement is a truly global phenomenon. So we recorded internal displacements in 151 countries in 2023. So it shows that no country is really immune to internal displacement, and people are displaced almost every single day. The displacements are recorded all the way from Canada to Haiti to Democratic Republic of the Congo, Palestine, India, and all the way to Asia and the Pacific. What's really concerning is that last year, 75.9 million people were remaining living in displacement as of the end of the year, which is the highest figure ever recorded. It's yet another record which was broken. More than half of the IDPs are living in just 5 countries. It's Sudan, Syria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Colombia, and Yemen. Unfortunately, these countries are rarely make it to the headlines of the news, so we rarely hear about them, yet they host a major protracted displacement crises. And just to demonstrate the complexity of the displacement, I can mention the 3 of them. First of them being Sudan, which is the country hosting the largest population of IDPs in the world. It's more than 9 million. And most of them have been displaced as a result of the recent escalation of violence in the country since last April. Then I spoke about Syria. Syria, on the other hand, hosts one of the most protracted IDP populations in the world. Many of them have been displaced for more than 10 years now. We are talking about 7.2 million people. And then the third one, Democratic Republic of the Congo, sort of mixes the two. So it's a country which hosts a large, protracted crisis. People have been living in displacement for decades, but at the same time, the conflict is still very active and ongoing. And we constantly witness people being redisplaced every year, multiple times per year, and their vulnerabilities and their resilience erodes with every new movement.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning Sudan and Syria. What other specific hotspots are there in the Middle East? Of course, Gaza is one of the key areas where there is huge numbers of internal displacements. But also, have you seen displacements in, say, for example, Saudi Arabia, where because of the major 2030 visions and the major projects that are being undertaken by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, there are internal displacements of towns and villages to make way for many of his major projects. So have you also seen internal displacements in the Gulf countries, and also, of course, in Gaza, where there are, 2.2 million people currently, Palestinians, facing famine and starvation. And their history, of course, is a history of being expulsion, ethnically cleansed, and the refugees. But that said, they are also now being internally displaced within the besieged enclave. So what other countries can you mention and speak about in terms of internal displacements in the Middle East?
Yeah, of course, and the situation in the Middle East is very alarming, as you rightly said. As of the end of 2023, 15.3 million people were living in displacement, which is the highest figure ever recorded for the region. And at the same time, in 2023, it was the year when the largest number of displacements occurred as a result of disasters, the highest since our records exist. So it's a very concerning year and many concerning developments. Now, the countries which suffer most from internal displacement are, of course, the ones you mentioned. It includes Palestine, but also Syria, Yemen, Iraq, or Libya. In many of these countries, we see that the numbers of IDPs are not decreasing, despite the fact that the conflicts might have reduced, such as the case of Syria, for example. And the numbers are not decreasing because people are not finding solutions, and they just remain living in displacement camps for a very long time. Syria is one of the countries which I would like to talk about right now, because it hosts nearly 10% of all the IDPs in the world. It's 7.2 million, so it's a large proportion. And as I said before, many of them have been displaced now for more than a decade. They are living in IDP camps and across host communities, mostly in Idlib and Aleppo, so in these 2 governorates. They host more than 50% of all the IDPs in the country. And what we saw in 2023 was that many of them were forced to flee once more, because the same areas were hit by a major earthquake in February 2023. It hit areas which have been heavily affected by conflict, Many of the housing structures were weakened by the airstrikes and ongoing conflict. And of course, when the earthquake hit, many of them collapsed. And we saw once more families packing all of their belongings and fleeing once more. What's even more concerning is that many of the families were separated, and we also saw many children fleeing by themselves and being separated from their parents. Last thing on Syria is that it's important to remember that many of the children who fled, they know nothing but displacement. They spend most of their childhood living in displacement, and it's key to ensure that they will be able to access education, and that we are able as international community to provide solutions and help them end their situation of displacement, so that we do not create another generation of lost education from these children. Then you asked about the situation in the Gaza Strip and in Palestine. Of course, the situation in the Gaza Strip is very concerning, very alarming. As of now, 4 out of 5 people living in the Gaza Strip have been displaced, and more than 60% of them have no home to return to because of the large-scale destruction. I think we all see it in the news these days that now people who are sheltering in Rafah, around Rafah, many of the IDPs, between 1.2 and 1.5 million, are asked to flee yet again because of the advancing offensives. As of today, we have reports of around 360,000 people being on the move, packing all their belongings and fleeing. Many of them have really nowhere to flee. Many are moving back to the areas which were previously deserted, which face high level of destruction from the previous bombings and fightings. So they go to areas where there is little to no access to basic services. Of course, the levels of food insecurity are extremely high. Around 93% of all the people living in Gaza face very high food insecurity. It's the largest proportion of a population since the measurements of food insecurity began 20 years ago. At the same time, the recent UN reports estimated it will take around 80 years to rebuild everything which has been destroyed in the Gaza Strip. And that basically means that many of the people who are currently living in Gaza and displaced in Gaza won't likely see their houses rebuilt in their lifetime.
Yes. And of course, the Palestinian case is one of continuous displacement and a cycle of displacement. We could talk at length about that, but I wanted to focus a bit more on the causes of those numbers of displacement, specifically in the Middle East. In the case of Gaza, of course, is state violence. But when you're speaking about Syria and other parts of the Middle East, what is the main driving force? Is it state violence, or is it armed groups, militias? So just give us an understanding of what is the cause of what is triggering this increase in displacement. Is it states or non-state actors in the Middle East as a whole?
Mm-hmm. So, of course, when it comes to conflict and violence and what the types of it trigger internal displacement, it's always a very complex issue. What our reports show that on the global level, non-state armed conflict is the one triggering most internal displacement globally, followed by international armed conflict. And the proportion of international armed conflict increased significantly in the past 2 years, mostly because of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and of course the conflict in Israel and Palestine, as you just mentioned. But again, the actors who are causing the violence and then the displacement really vary. We see armed groups, non-state armed groups, state actors, different communal militias, criminal groups. So it really depends on each context. And again, as a Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, we mostly look into the impact which this violence has on the displaced populations, and then what the needs of these people are, so that we can understand better how to support them in finding solutions.
And in terms of when it comes to other factors that is causing or triggering displacement, what else can you cite? Of course, there are a number of countries who are dealing with natural disasters. So how much of an effect is natural disaster, climate change having on the rise of internal displacement? Not just in the Middle East, of course, but elsewhere. We saw last year how Turkey is having to deal with huge numbers of internal displacements because of the because of the earthquake that took place. So what other factors other than violence can you have you seen that is causing a spike in internal displacement?
Yeah, of course, internal displacement is triggered by conflict, violence, but also by disasters, as you rightly say. And what's even more interesting is that in recent years, we actually see that both triggers overlap. And we see that in many countries, internal displacement is caused by both conflict, violence, and disasters. And it's very often the same people being affected by these several triggers, even in a span of 1 year. So just to give you an example, out of the 45 countries where we report on conflict displacement, 42 were also affected by disaster displacement. So you really see that the overlap is significant. And we can zoom in on Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where we see this happening very often. And at the same time, Sub-Saharan Africa region is the one where we saw the number of IDPs triple in the past decade. And we actually believe that these overlapping triggers are one of the factors which contribute to the fact that people are not finding solutions in displacement, and they are displaced multiple times by multiple triggers in a span of 1, 2, or 3 years. Just imagine that you, for example, in Somalia, you live in a displacement camp, you are displaced by violence, and then severe drought hits, or a widespread flooding can hit, and then you are forced to flee again. And we see that many of these people then flee to urban areas in Somalia, and they join communities of urban poor, and they become dependent on humanitarian assistance. And then they are stuck in this cycle of repeated, protracted displacement, and it becomes really difficult to recover from all these recurrent shocks and actually find solution to end their displacement. So I think it's just important to really keep in mind that these triggers overlap, and it's important to try to understand the issue of internal displacement from this more holistic perspective, and not to try to sell it just on trigger. This is conflict, this is violence, and this is natural disaster or disaster.
And talking about holistic perspective, just let's turn our attention to the global mechanism in dealing with internal displacements. What global mechanisms are there, and which countries would you say is coping better than others, and why is that? Why are they able to cope better than some that are struggling? And generally, what international mechanisms are there to support countries that are suffering from extreme internal displacement?
Indeed, there are some good examples, and we always try to highlight them so that we show what countries are actually dealing quite well with the displacement crisis, and what then other countries could do to learn from it and readapt it for their own context and for their own issues. One of these countries is actually in the Middle East, and I think it's quite a good example. It's Iraq, which faced a major conflict in the previous years. in 2016, 2017, the conflict between the government of Iraq and the Islamic State caused major displacement crisis. In 2017, it was around 6 million people who were displaced across the country. But when we look at the situation as of today, it's just above 1 million who remain displaced. It's still a large number, but there is, of course, a significant reduction when we compare it to a few years ago when we spoke about 6 million. And I think it's really interesting to look into what Iraq did to achieve this progress. I think there are two main factors, or there are many factors, but the two I would like to highlight is really the International Organization for Migration Return Index, where they were looking into assessing conditions in return areas for displaced people and trying to understand what the gaps are and what is preventing people from returning, and then understanding that help the international community and the government to provide better assistance and better funding to actually cover these gaps. Other important factor was the work which was done in collaboration between the government of Iraq and the United Nations Development Program, because the Iraqi society was deeply divided after the conflict, because many families were perceived as affiliated with the Islamic State, and therefore it was very hard for them to return or reintegrate back into the society. And in order to deal with that, the United Nations Development Program and the Iraqi government introduced a community-based reconciliation and reintegration program where they were working to establish peace mechanisms within communities to facilitate a reconciliation and social cohesion, with the aim to enable eventual return of these families. And actually this process included the local communities, local authorities, community leaders, civil society, and government leaders to establish social cohesion, while also working in a parallel to provide psychosocial and economic support to the communities where these families were returning to. And it really showed that this kind of collaboration and the whole society approach, it's probably the best one to address displacement crises in a really lasting and comprehensive manner. And you really need to include everyone, starting, of course, with the displaced people themselves, the local communities, and go all the way up through civil society to the government actors and the international organizations to really provide lasting solutions and ensure that displaced people are able to either return home or integrate locally, whatever their preferred solution is, and that this solution will be lasting and they will not get redisplaced in a few months or years again.
Now, I'm glad you highlighted Iraq as an example. It just shows that for it to be a success, you need a combined effort, not just by the Iraqis, but also globally as well. And when it comes to Iraq, globally, the international community was invested because of the war in 2003 that was launched by Western governments. And it's a country that has had a lot of investment, a lot of support, which is what's required to stabilize a country. On that, why do certain internally displaced populations decide to stay in the country, and some feel that they want to migrate and become refugees and move to, say, Europe? Does your report look into what is the motivations and the factors that drive people to leave their country and become refugees, and others to remain in their country? What would be the key factor, would you say, in your research that you found explains why some would choose to leave and become refugees?
That's an excellent question. There are many people actually asking that. And unfortunately, there's very little data which exists to provide any meaningful answers. And we ourselves had a specific research which looked into that. And we have some very limited findings on that. However, what we know is that many of people who eventually decide to go across border to either migrate or apply for asylum elsewhere typically get displaced internally before they cross the international border. And many of them get displaced multiple times internally before they decide to leave the country. So it just shows that probably crossing the border, it's not their first option, because they first endure internal displacement and try to find safe place within the country. And it also shows that it's important to address the internal displacement crises in the countries and support people inside their countries if they wish to stay there. We don't have enough data to understand exactly the motivation, at what point they decide to cross the border and seek asylum or migrate elsewhere. One of the factors which we know of from our research is that you need significant financial means to be able to do so. So for many of them, it's the fact that they can actually afford to cross the borders and start their lives elsewhere. And many of them who remain inside the countries are the ones which can't afford to go abroad, and their needs are usually very high. They are overlooked, and that's why we need to pay attention to the internal displacement crisis and really try to understand what the needs of these people are and how we can support them so that they can remain in their country if they wish so, and reestablish their lives there.
So one final question, the report has a number of charts showing how IDPs is growing year by year. So what final recommendations do you provide to governments across the world, of course, to ultimately reduce IDPs and also in dealing with people who are internally displaced? What are your final recommendations?
I think there would be two recommendations. First one is, there has never been a higher number of people living in internal displacement as there is today. But at the same time, there has never been a higher political will and commitment to actually resolve the crisis. And there has never been so much expertise and data and analysis on the phenomenon as there is today. So it's really an opportunity to support the internal displaced people and try to reduce these numbers once for all. It's important for all the international community, the governments, the experts to really work together, look beyond everyone's mandate and interest, and to really share all the information we have collectively and work towards providing and supporting internally displaced people to achieve solutions and to actually support them all along the displacement cycle, starting with prevention and trying to prevent internally displacement, to provide assistance and respond to displacement crises which are already happening, and the ones which are receding, to really work together towards providing solutions and understanding what the preferred solution is for each individual, and then support them in achieving it. The second point is that we have to include internally displaced families in the decision making, because it's ultimately them who need to tell us what they need and how and what sort of support they need. And again, if I end on one concrete example, we saw that happening in Ukraine recently, when IDP councils were established that actually gathered IDPs and local communities, and they work together towards understanding what the needs in each community are, what sort of assistance is needed. And also these mechanisms were very flexible because they are very local, to readjust as the situation in Ukraine was changing. And all this was combined with much broader response led by the government of Ukraine and the international actors. So again, it points back to the whole of society approach, when everyone needs to be involved in addressing internal displacement, starting with the IDPs themselves, local governments, local communities, national governments, and the international organizations to really work together to address the issue and make sure that next year, when our next report comes out, the numbers will be reduced. Exactly,
Yeah.
be reduced, and the outlook will be less grim than today.
Thank you, Ivana. That was Ivana Hajzmanova from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre. And read the report. It's really, really interesting to get an insight into how this growing concern is affecting politics locally and also globally. Yeah, and thank you also for tuning in, and see you in another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.